So today I want to talk about the most existential threat to um, the West, and especially, well, any kind of country that's could be considered the West, right? So you don't have to talk about necessarily America only or a European nation. You could talk about South Korea or Japan. Anything that really can be considered a Western society in the sense that it has democracy, that in the sense it has what we call modern capitalism, in the sense that it has certain values and ways of life. So this problem regards the family. And what you see with the West, and what you see with um, places like America is that literally these societies are dying in the sense that people are not having children, that they are um, losing population. And there's always this discussion of, let's go ahead and have more people move into it. Well, that doesn't really fix the problem here, for a number of reasons. One of which is that, the culture changes very drastically, at first, and so you kind of lose some of this culture that supposedly allowed it to succeed in the first place. But then, what happens is that within a generation, people just shift anyways to the culture that's already there. So that's not really a long-term solution. Um, when we want to think about any kind of problem, we want to think about what's healthy, and then we could talk about what's unhealthy. That's a much better way about going about things than to just point out various problems, you know? So, for example, at this moment, I'm hearing the neighbor dog bark, and that actually is that ties into one of the major problems resulting in a demographic collapse. But it doesn't help for me to just bring that up and then bring something else up like the dual income family and just shove it all in your face because it really doesn't tell us where to go. Okay? Because there's always going to be this problem, that problem, a number of problems that come up, and it will seem like it will be endless. Okay, and that's why we look at what's the proper model, what's the proper way of going about things. And that's why, Confucians talk about the Tao. They talk about a way that everybody participates in that helps out everybody as human beings. Okay, because the way that we're talking about is the way of human beings to to flourish, to be morally good, but also happy and joyful. Okay. So what is the Confucian model? Okay. Regarding the family, okay, the first thing that you do is that you want to marry at a timely age. All right. You don't want to do this thing that we're doing now where people are basically getting married north of 25 years old. In fact, if you get married at 25 years old, that's a little bit on the younger side in a lot of places in the West. All right. So, why do you want to marry at a timely age? There's a few reasons why. One is actually that you can bond better together. Okay. So, an argument that's often used against uh, getting married at a proper age, an age that we would consider too old, or I'm sorry, too young. Okay. So in other words, if you get married at 18, or if you even get married at 16, that is considered way too young to get married. And one of the arguments is that, oh, your brain is still developing. Oh, you're still trying to figure out who you are. Well, that's actually the same reason why you actually want to get married at an earlier age. Because as you get older, if you do believe that your brain is getting slower, less adaptive, it's changing, and you're becoming more stubborn, that's actually the reason you want to actually meet your wife or husband at an earlier age so that you can grow together, you could adapt to each other, and you can form one life. Now, if you get married at, say, 30, you've got your own habits, your own quirks, your own ways of looking at things, and it's going to be necessarily different from your spouse, and you're going to be butting heads all the time because you didn't grow up together. So you want to actually use that. Okay. The second reason is pretty obvious. The older you get, the less fertile you become. So it's harder to get pregnant. It's harder to have a healthy offspring from that union. And the older you get, actually, the busier you become, right? The less energy you have. And that becomes a big obstacle for actually conceiving healthy children, right? So, for those two major reasons, you want to actually marry at a timely age. And that age is not 24 or 25 even, is somewhere closer to 18, closer to 16. And the problems that supposedly come up with marrying at the age aren't really actually problems, they're benefits. All right. Now you might say, well, you don't really aren't these people kind of immature and that kind of thing? But I have to really ask, immature in what sense of that word, right? So in a financial sense, yes, you would be immature because you don't have all the training or so-called education. I don't really consider it education because to me, education is about virtue and philosophy. But yeah, I mean, at that age, you don't have a credential, you don't have what it takes to put together a resume so that you can apply to your job that requires less than 3 years of experience. So that's not there, but that doesn't mean you are incapable of devoting yourself as a husband or wife to your spouse. Because what that takes is sincerity, and what it takes is love. And those are things that you have at this age. You have the capacity to do that. There's nothing about becoming 25 or 30 years old that allows you to devote yourself better or to love somebody better, right? That's a decision. That's a moral decision. Okay. So it's not really the case that you can get older and then things will become better for you to find somebody else. There's also a practical problem wherein the uh the older you get, what you're actually doing is you're pushing off the first time that you have sex. Okay. And so because you're pushing that date off, and this is a biological need, it's a biological, we'll say compulsion. Okay. To be honest, it would be like starving yourself, right? It's something that the human body needs. It's something that the human body naturally seeks out. So what you end up having by pushing off marriage is you're going to have all these temporary relationships, okay, that are going to be entered into with the attitude of being temporary, and yet you have this biological need. So what ends up happening is premarital sex. And that gets me to the second thing that needs to happen. So not only are you marrying at a timely age, this is going to be related to the next point, which is the importance of valuing chastity. All right. So you need to make sure that people understand the importance of chastity. Okay, what is chastity exactly? Okay, I'm going to define words very carefully because in the Western world, the word chastity just means a general kind of sexual restraint. And I don't think that's a very precise way of understanding things. Okay, so what is chastity? I'm going to make um, chastity specifically about women, and we're going to talk about the male equivalent of that in a bit. Okay, but what we want to do is we want to think about chastity as when we're focusing on women, one woman, and she only sleeps with one man for her entire life. Okay? Before marriage, during marriage, after marriage, she doesn't get remarried. All right. In terms of Confucian policy to do this, there's a number of ways that this is encouraged. Okay. So, one, they would actually financially support chaste widows. Okay. Women who lost their husband but would not get remarried. Okay. There would be monuments to women who would fight for their chastity. Okay, so if your country is being invaded, well, you know what tends to happen during that time, okay? And there are women who would rather take their own lives than to lose their chastity, okay? So there are monuments built to those women, all right? There are cultural works like the Joseon Dynasty, that's the last kingdom of Korea, published something called basically a rough translation would be the three fundamental bonds, okay, the three fundamental relationships. So exemplary stories of exemplary sons, exemplary wives, and exemplary ministers, okay, and other people too, right? So these are basically moral paragons, okay? And a large section of that would be about women who really truly devoted themselves to their husbands, really truly love their husbands. And I haven't been using that word too often, love, because I think these days the term love has been used rather broadly, rather vaguely, as if it's just a feeling. What love really is devotion. Okay. Yes, we want to feel happy and joyful when we're with this person, but there's a lot of times where this person could make us pretty miserable, right? Or cause lots of problems. But if you abandon this person at that point, you know this is not love. Okay. This was just enjoyment. It's a very materialistic attitude. Okay. So what you want to do so far, one, marry people at a timely age. Two, really value chastity. Okay. The benefit of valuing chastity, um, while that strengthens the marital bond, that gets to number three, which is that you want to actually value patriarchy, right? What is patriarchy? That's another term that is ill-defined, vaguely used, and causes all sorts of problems in our discourse, in our discussion of the family. What is patriarchy? Is it just male dominance? No, it's not that. What patriarchy is a way to order the family in terms of authority, and that's kind of another word that is because of because of our democratic ethos, it's kind of looked down upon and such. Um, but authority is really important, right? Because it tells us a structure of leadership. Okay, if everybody is doing their own thing, then either decisions take forever and they're made poorly. And oftentimes people just are never satisfied. I mean, nobody's really satisfied with a compromise, and compromises tend to be ineffective because they're not really efficient. They're not really pointing at one direction. Oftentimes, I mean, think about living life as a series of paths, right? You have the path going to the right and the path going to the left, and the compromise would be right in the middle. Well, that just gets you into a bunch of trouble, right? A lot of grass and woods and mud in the middle of those two paths. So when we're thinking about order, we have to think about authority. And when we're thinking about authority, we want to think about patriarchy, right? So when we're thinking about patriarchy, what does that mean exactly? Yes, it does have to do with males leading, but it's in a particular way. So if you're looking at two levels of the family, right? There's the so-called nuclear family, which is father, mother, and children. And there's the larger extended family, which you could call the clan, all right? That would be including your cousins, your uncles and aunts, your grandfather, your grandmother, all right? That's getting us more towards a clan, okay? And so we have a kind of leadership. So, you would follow your father, and then your father would follow his father, right? So there's a kind of a structure there inherently. Um, why fathers and not fathers and mothers? Okay, why is it that the wife is going to be um, obedient to the um, to the husband, and what does obedience mean? Okay, so this is something that is going to be, if we look at modern discourse, it's going to be dumbed down. All right, it's not going to be discussed into the nuance that actually exists in history, particularly Confucian societies in Confucian philosophy. So let's start with it this way. Um, Sons are supposed to be filial to their fathers. Okay, sons are supposed to remonstrate with their fathers when they are wrong. All right. Shunzi, he's an important Confucian philosopher, and I recommend looking at him. Um, he says, follow righteousness, not your father. Follow the Tao, the right way, not your Lord, right? So uh, what you're truly obeying is what is morally right, not simply the person who is your father or your Lord just because he wants to go in a certain direction. Okay. So you're supposed to remonstrate, you're supposed to object, you're supposed to respectfully point out what is wrong, whether it's a moral thing, whether it's a strategic thing, or whether it's the wrong tactic, right? You're supposed to have these discussions. Okay. Wives, what is a wife? Wives are compared to being the prime minister. So if the Lord, excuse me, if the father is like the Lord or the king of the house, of the household, then the wife is the prime minister. Okay, she is a primary advisor. If you look at history, if you look at monarchy history, the prime minister tends to be more talented and capable than the king himself. Okay. The king, of course, through rules of succession, um, inherits the throne, right? But the prime minister is chosen on the basis of ability. So when we say that wives are submissive to their husbands, this is not just being some kind of hand servant. This is actually this is a position of influence and responsibility and even discretion. Okay, it is not something that is to be looked down upon. So it's a great responsibility. Okay. So that's how that would work. Okay. Now you might say, well, why don't we just follow the more capable individual, whether it's male or female? This has to do with just simply having to acknowledge and recognize that men and women really are different. Okay. So we have different capabilities, right? And and so this is kind of more of a discussion for another time because I could speak for an hour on this. But in summary, men have an ability to, I think, lead their families in a way that's a bit different from women. Okay, in the sense that I think men could be, just generally speaking, a bit more objective, um, a bit more, uh, maybe clear in their ability to implement standards within the family and outside the family. Um, Whereas I think, women could be a lot um, much more fiercer supporters, but they could kind of maybe lose sight of objectivity in doing so. Okay, so that's something that is typically generally true. But traditionally, of course, um, and not just traditionally, it's still true in the modern age. Life is dangerous, and it's better for men to be out there dealing with people outside the family than women, you know, in general. Now, you can say, well, society shouldn't be that way and so forth, but that's so I think ingrained in human nature that you can't really find a social full solution to this. Okay. But again, this is kind of worth talking about some other time in more depth. Um, so does that make sense so far?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So part of valuing patriarchy is also the need for memorial ceremonies. Your father passes away, then you memorialize them. Okay. What this all does, right? Why am I talking about this in the context of patriarchy, filiality, and and wifely submissiveness? Um, why does this all go together? Because it creates a kind of order and it ensures, like chastity, it ensures that people know where they belong and it ensures that the family is working together and that they have an ability to make decisions coherently and intelligently and with good coordination. All right. So you marry at a timely age, You value chastity, those two things help for bonding. You value patriarchy that allows for leadership and the implementation of generations long strategy. All right. Now it still doesn't end there. You also use what's called Li, right? If you're not familiar with this, it's kind of translates into something like ritual propriety, ceremony, maybe even high culture or refined culture, um, even more everyday things like manners and etiquette and consideration. All right. So it kind of all connects that together. So the family acts according to Lee. You set proper boundaries. You have customs. Okay. You have good relations with each other as a result of those boundaries and customs. Right. And I think that's something that's been lost. If you look at, for example, somewhere like South Korea today, Korea has been through a lot. And it's been through a lot the last number of generations, last few generations. It's been through Japanese colonization, which was um, very, very violent, very oppressive. It's been through a civil war, and then it's been through an accelerated modernization process, which introduced a lot of conflicting ideas, but also simply broken ideas, right? Because we're talking about how the West is dying, right? And it's during this time where these Western ideas are imported into Korea. All right. So you have all of these really severe problems there. And so when we see something like people are talking about, oh, they have a Confucian ethos, that's not true. It's really not true. Okay. Because you don't see any of this Li, this customs, these boundaries, these rituals. Um, you don't see any of that really being practiced for the most part on a daily basis. Okay. Some of it is there. That's true. Some of it is there. It's not completely gone. But, if you look at some of this, and, I know the audience is primarily English speaking, right? So if you know some of these people who have immigrated to an English speaking place like America, right? What you're going to see in the behavior is not really Lee, where, there's this kind of, maybe you could say just generally a lack of personal space, abstractly speaking, Um, that's if that's not there, you don't have Lee, right? So Lee, in the context of the family, does things to remind you of your proper relationships to each other, okay? The reciprocity, okay? So in other words, if you are filial as a son, right, the father has certain obligations too, right? And Shunzhu points out, if one side fulfills their duties, but the other one doesn't, it's still disorder, it's still chaos, it's still dysfunctional, right? So the father needs to be a certain way to the son, and the son needs to be a certain way to the father. The son needs to be respectful, the father needs to be affectionate. Okay. And that goes true for any of these relationships. Okay. So, what we have there is something to really help facilitate relationships, right? You're not going to into some kind of excess. You are showing, um, you know, affection and respect for each other, and you're not transgressing into, um, you know, you're not transgressing into somebody's boundaries. Okay. All right. So far we've got marrying at a timely age. We've got valuing chastity. We've got a patriarchal order. We've got ritual. We've got Lee. Okay. Um, of course, we want to talk about economics. Okay. Mencius points out very often that the environment is very important. If your environment is bad, then you can't really succeed. Okay. And this is something that you want to keep in mind, actually, that the environment is important. And this can be split into two aspects here. One, economics, and two, the neighborhood life or the village life back in those days. Okay. So let's talk about economics. You need enough food. Okay. Obviously, you need shelter. That's been the case forever, but you also need to be able to allow the family to spend time with each other, right? So that's not something that really happens, especially with stuff like a dual income situation. What about the uh community itself, right? So your neighborhoods need to be quiet and safe. Okay? If your government is not doing that, you don't have a real government anymore, right? I mean, if it's purposely neglecting you, if it's intentionally neglecting you, it's not really being a government. If you have a friend and he never calls you, never asks how you're doing, and when you need help, he is nowhere to be found, you know that's not a friend. So if a government is allowing your neighborhood to become loud, noisy, disorderly, you don't have a government. You don't have a government. It's just an exploitation scheme where you know, financial resources are being extracted out of you. All right. Quiet neighborhoods are really important. You need it to be quiet in order for people to live with dignity, in order for children to have enough sleep, in order for parents to have enough sleep. All right. Because when you have noise, it doesn't matter where it comes from. It could come from noisy cars. It could come from people blasting so-called music. It could come from dogs barking. It could come from even people just being really loud outside, talking outside. Okay. If any of those things happen, what you have is a dysfunctional situation. What you have is disorder because you need quiet to be able to think. You need quiet to be able to reflect. You need to be able to reflect in order to grow. Okay, if you don't have these things, I mean, these are a serious, serious issue. If you don't have these things, you don't have a decent place to live, and you don't have a government. Okay. All right, let's talk about the larger community. Outside of enforcing law, what do we have? Okay. We have we want what we want to have is um, the larger community in a sense paralleling the family structure. All right. So your Lord should be like a father figure. Okay. Um, your teachers should be like a father figure in the sense that they can, point out where you're going wrong and correct you. In fact, Mencius will say that you need teachers so that the father doesn't have to keep correcting the son, because if that keeps happening, then there'll be antagonism between father and son rather than the affection that you want. So you would have, in a sense, the discipline, particularly as the son gets older, goes to a teacher. All right. So that's what I do when I discipline my own students, right? I tell them what they need to know so that their fathers do not have to keep pounding a message into their heads, which will just cause hostility between father and son. Okay. The elders in your neighborhood, in your community, should be like uncles. All right. So there shouldn't be a case where somebody in his mid 20s is not showing any respect to somebody in their 40s, for example. Right. That should just never happen. But I see that happening in dysfunctional neighborhoods all the time. Okay. If you're thinking about it in terms of social class, right, your aristocracy would be like your firstborn. Okay. So in other words, the elder brother is looking out for the younger brothers. Okay. It's not the same thing as a father, but they're looking out after the younger ones and modeling good behavior. That's what your aristocrats should do. Now, just because you're wealthy doesn't mean you're an aristocrat, obviously. And that really kind of hints at another kind of dysfunction that we suffer is that your wealthy are not role models, morally speaking, for your uh, less wealthy classes. Okay. All right, so that's the Confucian model. You marry at a timely age, you value chastity, you have a patriarchal order. We talked about the nuances of that a bit. We talked about Li, right? Ritual propriety, culture, customs, etiquette, and so forth that guide the family towards harmony. Um, we talked about economics, and we talked about the larger community, how they should behave towards each other, how neighbors should behave towards each other, and so forth. So, are there any questions or comments here so far?
No comment, no question.
All right. Let's look at the American model and what's going on with America and the West in general. So America, I choose that because I'm most familiar with Americanism. I also think America tends to portray the most, in some ways, the most extreme versions of the West, but also because lots of people know what America is like, as opposed to some really smaller countries. Okay, so what does America do? It encourages atomization. All right. And it discourages family bonds and cohesion, right? So let's kind of talk about how this actually works. This all comes from the sort of ideas of individualism and equality. It's not that individuals don't exist. It's not that we shouldn't assess people as individuals. The issue is that individualism becomes really a nice way or euphemism to say selfish, right? So what we're really doing is glamorizing selfishness, and that's something that is criticized really all over the place. You know, you have Socrates, or you could say Plato, criticizing this, um, but most famously, we have the rectification of names that Confucius argues for, where the Confucians in general um, assess or they clarify that words need to correspond to reality and to their actual definitions, right? So if we're talking about something called individualism, that really ends up the way it's used as a way to glamorize selfishness, all right? Um, it could alternatively be used to talk about a mentality that everybody is born unique. You just need to figure out what that is, and then go beat to the or go march to the beat of your own drum. And that's also flawed too, because human beings are far more malleable. They're not blank slates, right? There's still a fundamental human nature, and there are still proclivities. But ultimately, the thing that makes us most happy and most joyful is the same for everyone. We all want to get married, we all want to be loved, and we all want to love, right? So the question is, how can we best do that, right? So individualism distracts us from that common reality, that fundamental human reality. Okay. Am I making sense so far? Is this pretty good?
Makes sense.
All right. So let's talk about how exactly American and American policy works to get in the way of the proper model and the healthy family. All right. So first we have untimely marriage, right? Because you send these young people to high school, then now we're supposed to go to college. So we've got 4 years here and then 4 years somewhere else. And then after college, you're back out there and who knows where you'll be. So now you're talking about at least 8 years, 8 years where you should be looking for a spouse, but now you cannot actually commit. All right. So that's a big problem. All right. You're having a lot of these untimely marriages, and nobody even thinks to say, okay, well, what if we get married before we go to college? Nobody does that. And college admissions policies, of course, make it very difficult to do something like that. Right. So that's something that needs to be fixed. Number two, this culture collectively discourages chastity to absurd degrees. All right. If you look at the fashion, right, whether we're talking about wearing swimsuits, we're talking about wearing leggings instead of actual pants or dresses, we're looking at the length of dresses. If we're looking at men and just go around with their shirts off, if we're looking at um, a lot of this kind of fashion, it is not properly separating men and women from each other. Okay. And so that just unconsciously or subconsciously sends a message that these things are not important because chastity ultimately is based on the principle of you're intimate with only this one person and not intimate with others. Okay. And that goes for both male and female in the sense that, women, you know, they want to bond to one person, and men, it's possible for men to have more than one wife historically because they have the ability to want to protect and keep multiple women. Okay. It's a little like being a parent, right? You could have one child, you could have five children, right? It doesn't mean you love any of the children any less. However, you as a child, you can only have one father, you can only have one mother. You can't have multiple fathers, right? The term father figure is an analogy, it's not an actual relation. Okay, there's only one father, right? So that's kind of how it works with husbands and wives, right? Historically, husbands can have multiple wives, a wife can have only one husband, right? Because we're biologically set up that way. Okay. All right. So this idea of you only show your body to one person, right, and not to just the public, that's not around, and that discourages chastity. What about high school activities? I mean, look at the cheerleading and that kind of thing. It's basically accepting this kind of mode of dress, but also, things like prom, I think is just it's kind of like a imitation marriage. If you look at it, if you think about it, it ends up being kind of an imitation marriage in the sense that you are, you know, when you're, you have this partner, right? This counterpart, this mate, right? And then you wear this beautiful gown and he dresses up and you're going in there together in front of everybody. And then, it's supposed to be like a magical night and then you're done, right? And it's just very bizarre to me, at the age that historically you'd be getting married, you're going to prom. Okay. Um, so a lot of these high school activities already kind of, under the guise of, this is acceptable because your teachers who are supposed to be role models and everything are accepting of this. You're doing all this sort of stuff that is, you know, implicitly, it's not unchaste, but it's kind of like gearing your thoughts and feelings, your emotional habituation away from chastity, right? Now look at the music, right? A lot of the music flat out is lascivious, is encouraging promiscuity, even sort of like this acceptance of, oh, heartbreak is inevitable. Heartbreak is not inevitable. Okay, you probably uh, should think a bit more about who you're ending up with, right, and how far that takes you. Okay. So just on a purely psychological basis, you have all this that discourages chastity, your movies, your stories, your music, your activities, your fashion, everything cultural basically discourages chastity. Um, okay. We talked about the importance of patriarchy. This culture also discourages patriarchy. You have the myth of the bad father. Um, these various myths about bad fathers. There's no memorial ceremonies. So what's a bad father, actually, myth? It's just this idea that fathers are inferior parents to mothers. Like fathers just not loving enough, or, they're kind of selfish or they're rough. And that's just, I think this is a myth. I think if you look at most fathers, this isn't really not the case. There's no perfect father, and also with any relationship, there's always people who are bad people, right? There's always bad mothers out there, there's bad fathers, like so forth. There's not a reason to um, categorically dismiss the entire relationship. The mem We don't have memorial ceremonies, right? The What's good about a memorial ceremony is that it gets the entire family together, sometimes the extended family together to do this really important thing to remind themselves they come from a common root and that they're related, right? So without a memorial ceremony, you just kind of gradually forget your cousins exist. Okay. Um, you don't have, people don't even get to take time off for mourning their father. That's a big issue in Confucianism. You take off 3 years to mourn your father, um, and it entails certain things, and that's another subject, another topic for another time. But we don't even get time off. People just go right back to work. And when I observe that, I see people who never really recover from that. They're very, um, they're very disturbed after that, psychologically, spiritually, because you really do need time to mourn. Okay. Men are encouraged to think within only one generation instead of more than one generation. Okay. So they just think about, okay, how will my kids get a job? They don't think about how will my kids meet their wife or husband, my son or daughter-in-law? How will they raise their children? How can they have children at a timely time? How will they raise the children well? They don't think about these things, right? Because if you did think about these things, you would have to actually think about not only your children's generation and your grandchildren's generation, but every generation into perpetuity, right? You would have to keep thinking about that. You would have to think about what's sustainable, what is reproducible, right? You would have to think about literally your reproductive success. Okay. You would have to think about traditions and customs, and you would have to think about finances that are sustainable and, you know, can keep lasting, right? Because look at things nowadays. There's a lot of people and their lineage is going to close. Their last names are not going to be passed down. Okay, because people are not having enough children, people are not having enough sons, people are not having raising their children well, they're not marrying their daughters to good men, they're not finding good wives or helping their sons find good wives, right? So those are all problems. Okay, I want to take a break here and ask, do you have any questions? Am I making pretty good sense here?
Makes sense so far. Yeah.
Okay. All right. The next thing is we talked about Li, ritual propriety, okay, manners, etiquette, ceremony. Um, well, America doesn't have these things, right? We don't have any cultural refinement. We have culture, it's not refined culture. All right. There's no really family lead. We can barely get the family to eat dinner at the same time and not be on the phone. All right. That's an extreme lack of family lead. It's almost like we're savages with high technology. And actually, historically, all right, barbarians, they have actually pretty good technology. Attila the Hun had great technology, the same technology that the Romans had, plus some innovations. Okay. So if you look at a lot of these people who are very successful invaders, they had high technology. And that's something you might want to think about if you think that, your civilized, your society, your so-called civilization has great technology. It doesn't mean you're actually civilized, right? It doesn't mean you're actually better than barbarians or savages or whatever term you want to use here. Okay, we'll talk about the distinction between these two maybe another time. Um, there's no family leave. There's no cultural refinement. All right, these things accelerate disintegration. These things create friction, right? We lose harmony. Okay. The laws enable and encourage easy divorce, no fault divorce. I mean, it's in the name there. Okay. Most states do not recognize common law marriage where you move in together and you live together, then you're basically married. You just skipped the marriage ceremony, right? So you are living the life of a married couple, but the law is not going to hold you up to that. This society allows for courthouse marriages, all right? And I think that's a big problem. You you should have a full ceremony. Why? Because the ceremony symbolizes certain things. It doesn't have to be expensive, right? In fact, good li, right, good ritual and ceremony are relatively simple. They're relatively inexpensive, but they're full of symbolism. Symbolism to help you understand what your proper rules are to each other are, what your proper duties are to each other, right? To express the love, right? To transform your soul, to transform to transform you spiritually as you go through the wedding ceremony. All right. It's not just a big party. Okay. And so just going and signing paperwork in front of a judge is not enough. It doesn't have that symbolism. All right. And we shouldn't allow for that at all. Okay. Lastly, we don't even punish adultery, right? Not even in a financial sense. It used to be that if you're thinking about, biblical Israel, or if you're thinking about, a Confucian society, it was a serious crime to commit adultery. You could face the uh, death penalty, right? And think about actually, especially back then, how serious this is. If you're, if someone's mother is caught having committed adultery, all of a sudden they don't know who their father really is. That completely can spiritually destroy a human being, just psychologically destroy him, right? So it completely destroys the whole family to treat adultery so lightly. Adultery is a very sick and evil sin. It's an evil crime, and nobody should ever take that lightly. Okay. So the fact that punishments do not accord with infractions tells you that this is a completely wrong policy. If you look at the rectification of names, okay, I believe that is 13.1 in the Analytics. It all starts with if you don't ensure that words accord with reality, then you have all these problems, including that the punishments don't fit, right? Um, and if you looked at it, right, if at the beginning of our lesson, what did we do? We looked and defined these terms precisely, right? We didn't just throw out a word like patriarchy or chastity. We defined them very clearly, right? So that we can have the proper model, we can have proper policy, right? But if you have sloppy terms like individualism, right? If you don't use it, if you don't know what chastity really means and so forth, look at this. Look at where we are. We don't even punish adultery, even financially, even in terms of custody of the children, in terms of splitting things during the divorce. We don't look at any of that. Okay. And there's no such thing as no fault divorce. That's ridiculous. At least one person is at fault. Okay. It might be both spouses, but at least one person is at fault. Right. Okay. The next thing, right? Earlier on, I talked about the dog barking. It's barked a few more times. We live in a society where we protect animals over human beings. We almost prioritize animals, if as long as they're pets, somebody's pet, over human beings. Pets are valued even more than fathers. They're certainly more valued than children, and it's completely dysfunctional. This is an apex symptom of mental illness. Okay, to treat something like a dog or a cat, which is really what's called a brood parasite. It's kind of tricking your brain into, loving and adoring it. Look, a cat and a dog is nothing like a human being. And this is its own kind of lecture. What's going on psychologically, spiritually, morally with these people who basically treat their dogs and cats as their own human children, right? Um, that's its own discussion. But the problem we see here is that, look, how is it ever that you feel like you can just bring over your dog or yeah, your dog to somebody's dinner party without asking for permission, without considering the other guests there, right? How is it that you could just let your dog go out to the grocery store where there's food and, get it all dirty? How could you just let your dog bark and bark and bark? These are extremely perverse evils. It's not about the number of people who have died under the regime, right? Like people point at Hitler and stuff, but it's really about how much of a reckless disregard, how much of a disregard do you have to goodness and decency? That's really the mark of evil. It's not about the numbers, all right? Think about it more qualitatively, right? So we have a really dysfunctional culture here, right? And think about all the movies that really, show dogs in such a positive light. It's really ridiculous. And the dog or cat or the animal is just an animal. It cannot love you the way that a human being can, right? It doesn't have that ability, all right? Okay. Our economics are clearly dysfunctional. It's just worth mentioning because everybody knows a dual income family is not a sustainable family. Okay. When you're out there for more than 8 hours, right, which might not even include traffic, it might even include overtime, it might not even include being asked to work at home through email or whatever, right? When you collect all that time together and even the children are at school and such, and you come back and you're tired and exhausted, you're not in the mood to really have fun and get along, right? That's going to destroy your family, right? Who's raising the kids, right? Both parents are out there working. In the Bay Area, you have these people, they're basically putting their kids into nursery when they're like 3 months old. That's terrible. That's terrible. We need policy to make sure that a dual income family is not a necessity. All right. And there's different ways to go about this. It's not. the topic of today is something that I discuss in my book coming out, but it's not really, it's not something that is an acceptable situation and that can be changed by policy. The next thing is that the larger community are effectively strangers to each other. Um, we're talking about the larger community here, right? The larger community is strangers to each other. You don't really know your neighbors, and if you do, typically you won't get along with them, right? In fact, the reason you know your neighbors, is probably because there's some problem, and that problem hasn't been resolved because of a lack of like a lack of good culture, right? Good culture doesn't happen on its own. It needs to be actually taken care of. It needs to be actually generated. It needs to be cultivated. It needs to be created. It needs to be composed. And that happens because you have an aristocracy and or a king that is capable, through their own high culture, of funding and finding people who are capable of making good works. Okay. So that's, its own kind of subject. But that's not what's happening right now. The politicians are puppets of the wealthy. The wealthy are the parasites of the commoners. The old compete with the young. That's something that Plato says, or at least Socrates says in the Republic. Um, that in democracy, the old compete with the young. So there's just larger problems out there. Now, those larger problems still encroach on the family because you're out there, you're learning, your children are learning from those people. You're stressed out dealing with these people. And if their noise enters into your home, or financially speaking, you might lose your home, that's incredible distress on the family. I don't like the term stress. I think it's too vague and imprecise, but it causes a lot of anxiety. It causes a lot of distress. It causes people to become distraught. It causes a lot of anguish and worry and consternation upon every member of the family. All right. Look, if you have a community, if you have a society, if you have a government that allows this all to happen, has no idea how to actually set up a society that is pro-family, right? Because just telling people to have kids isn't going to fix it. Just telling people to be better husbands and wives and lecturing them on that basis isn't going to do anything, right? If the thing all you're doing is saying, hey, you should want to be a mom and spend time with your kids. If that's the only thing you're saying, you have no idea how to govern. No idea. And if that's the case, your whole way of life, your whole state, your whole society is going to go extinct. And if you're going to run things this badly and have an attitude that the fundamentals of how you live your life, hyper individualistically, right? Just attempting to impose equality where it doesn't and shouldn't exist, right? Um, and being complacent with a government that does not actually govern, you're going to go extinct. And quite frankly, a society that's like that is not only going to go extinct, it really does actually deserve to die.